Sirenia had always believed her life would remain quiet and controlled. She worked in the shining white halls of Velara's Central Medical Institute, tending to patients with a calm, careful hand. Her people were known for their delicate health and long lifespans. And the thought of disrupting that balance with anything unpredictable, especially something as unpredictable as a human, was unthinkable to her. Humans were fast-moving, short-lived, and too often careless with their own lives. In Sirenia's mind, starting a family with one was a recipe for heartbreak. The stories she had heard as a child had shaped that fear. Mixed children, she'd been told, often inherited the weaknesses of both species rather than the strengths. The emotional pain when the human parent aged and died so quickly was said to be unbearable for Valerans, who could live centuries. So, she kept her life simple. She lived alone in a small apartment overlooking the ocean, filled with soft blue lights and quiet music. She avoided the military sector, where humans were often stationed. If she had to treat one in the clinic, she remained polite, distant, and professional. It was easier that way. She could heal a wound without opening herself to a deeper connection. That changed the day the treaty came into effect. It was a warm afternoon when the news was announced. The Valoran High Council had signed a military partnership agreement with the Terran Alliance. The two forces would train together, share resources, and learn each other's methods. Sirenia had no interest in politics, but when the assignments were posted the next day, she saw her name and felt her chest tighten. She was to join a joint medical unit for a 6-month term that would work directly alongside human soldiers. Her first day was worse than she expected. The human section of the base smelled different, the air thicker with the scent of metal and fuel. The humans were louder than Valerans, their laughter quick, their voices deeper. Sirenia kept her distance, moving between supply cabinets and the examination bays without meeting anyone's eyes. But even as she tried to focus on her own work, she could hear them. They spoke casually with one another, sharing jokes even in the sterile environment of the medical ward. She didn't understand how they could be so relaxed then. During a training exercise in the wide outdoor field, everything went wrong. Sirenia was in the observation tent, monitoring medical scanners, when the alarm sounded. A live fire accident had occurred, something about a malfunctioning drone weapon. Within seconds, the injured began to arrive, carried in on stretchers or limping on their own. She moved quickly, her hands steady, tending to burns and lacerations. But then she heard a voice from outside, urgent and strained. "Magnetic. We need a magnetic now." She stepped out into the bright sunlight and saw him for the first time. The human soldier was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform scorched along one arm. His hair was dark, his eyes sharp and alert even through the pain. In his arms, cradled like something precious, was a young Valoran recruit barely out of training. The recruit's breathing was shallow, his armor cracked from the blast. The human captain, Elias Ward. She would later learn, set the recruit down gently on the ground, and knelt beside him. Ignoring the blood soaking his own sleeve, Sirenia crouched beside them without thinking, scanning the recruit with her portable device. "He needs oxygen and stabilizers," she said sharply. "Help me lift him." Elias obeyed without hesitation, moving with surprising gentleness. When they transferred the recruit to the med bay, she noticed the way his hand lingered protectively near the boy until the monitors confirmed he was stable. Only then did he allow another medic to lead him to a bed for treatment. "You're injured?" Sirenia told him, glancing at the scorch mark on his arm. "Severe burn? Sit." He did, his gaze calm on her face. "It's nothing." He was in the blast radius. I was closer. Easier for me to move him than for him to move himself. Easier, she asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. Elias gave a small shrug, the corner of his mouth lifting faintly. "I've carried heavier loads." She didn't know what to say to that. She cleaned the burn and applied the healing gel. She found herself aware of how still he sat, how he didn't flinch or pull away. Most humans she had treated were restless under her care, impatient to be moving again. He was patient, measured. When she was finished, she stepped back. "You'll need to keep that arm out of combat training for a few days." He nodded, thanked her simply, and left to check on the young recruit before returning to his own quarters. Over the next few days, Serenia tried to convince herself that the incident meant nothing. Humans sometimes acted heroically, it didn't erase their recklessness. But her mind kept returning to the image of Elias shielding the recruit, to the calm in his voice when he had spoken to her. He didn't match the stories she'd heard. As a child, her resolve to stay distant began to fray when he returned for follow-up treatment. Instead of complaining about the delay in his training, he asked her about valor and medicine, how their healing gels worked, why their surgical methods were different. His interest seemed genuine, his questions careful and respectful. "You study for decades to be a medic here?" he asked during one session. "Yes," she replied. "Our physiology is complicated. A mistake can cause lasting harm." "That's true for humans too," he said. "But you take it more seriously than we do. I like that." The words were simple, but something in his tone made her glance at him more closely. There was no mockery in his face, no hint of impatience, just quiet sincerity. She told herself it was still nothing. But then the disease outbreak happened. It began with one human soldier collapsing in the training yard, fever burning high. Within hours, others both human and Valorant were showing the same symptoms: coughing fits, weakness, and rapid dehydration. The base went into lockdown. The medical team was stretched thin, working day and night. Serenia barely had time to eat, much less think about her fears. Elias was assigned to assist her unit in delivering supplies to the isolation wards. She saw him moving from bed to bed, not just bringing water or medicine, but speaking to the patients, calming them, making them feel seen. When one young Valorant child cried out for her parents, Elias knelt beside her, his voice soft, his words reassuring. Serenia caught herself watching him longer than she meant to, something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Late one night, when the ward was quiet, she found him sitting in the corner, exhaustion clear on his face. She brought him a cup of water. "You're not on duty tonight," she said. "I know," he replied. "But the kid in bed 12 gets scared when the lights dim. I thought I'd stay until she falls asleep. It was such a small thing, but it unsettled her more than any dramatic act of heroism could." She had always imagined humans as fierce and impulsive. But here was a man who would sit for hours just so a frightened child could rest, as the outbreak slowly came under control. Serenia realized something she didn't want to admit. She was beginning to trust him, not humans in general, just him. And that, she thought, was dangerous enough. One evening, after the last patient had been settled, Elias approached her at the supply station. "Thanks for letting me help," he said. "I know I'm not medical staff. I just didn't want to stand around when there was something to do." She hesitated, then nodded. "You did help. More than you realize." He smiled faintly, and for a moment they simply stood there. The silence between them not uncomfortable, but something else, something she wasn't ready to name. When she returned to her apartment that night, she found herself looking out over the ocean, the lights of the human ships blinking on the horizon. For the first time in years, she wondered if her fears were entirely her own, or if they were shadows cast by other people's voices. Voices that had never met someone like Captain Elias Ward. And though she tried to dismiss the thought, it stayed with her until morning. The medical wing of the Joint Base had grown quieter after the outbreak ended, but the echoes of the long nights and tense hours still clung to its walls. Serenia noticed the difference in her own steps. They were slower now, not because she was tired, but because she sometimes lingered to see who was around. She told herself she was just checking supplies or making sure the human soldiers were following safety protocols. But in truth, part of her was looking for Elias. He had returned to his regular duties, yet he often passed through the medical area with one reason or another, sometimes to deliver reports, sometimes to collect training medkits, and sometimes she suspected for no reason except to see how things were. He never overstayed his welcome, never pried into her personal life, but his presence had become something she expected. She wasn't sure when that had happened. One afternoon, Elias came in with a small data slate tucked under his arm. He had changed out of his training armor into a lighter uniform, his arm fully healed from the burn she had treated. He greeted her with that steady, calm voice she had begun to recognize as his natural tone. "I brought the updated medical roster," he said, handing her the slate. "Thought you might need it sooner rather than later?" She took it, scanning. "Through the names? Thank you. This will help with the next rotation." Elias leaned slightly against the counter, watching her work. "Do you ever get time off?" he asked after a moment. "Rarely," she replied, without looking up. "Not in this assignment. We're short-staffed, and Valoran medics are trained differently than humans. It's not always easy to replace us. I guess that means you. Don't get to see much outside the base. I prefer it that way," she said automatically. "The city is crowded." He gave a quiet hum, the sound neither agreement nor disagreement. "When I first came here, I thought the same about the human sector. Too loud, too much movement. But after a while, you start finding the quiet spaces. You just have to look for them." She glanced at him, surprised by the thought. "Do humans need quiet spaces?" "More than we like to admit," he said, smiling faintly. "We just fill the noise so people don't notice when we're listening." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she focused on finishing her entries into the system. "I liked her." The words stayed in her mind. She had always thought humans thrived in chaos, but perhaps there was more to them than that. The following week, joint training operation was scheduled in the open plains north of the base. Saranya was assigned as part of the medical support team, which meant she had to travel with the soldiers. She packed the necessary supplies, expecting the day to be long but uneventful. The exercises were usually controlled with minimal risk. Elias was among the soldiers in the convoy. As they moved out into the wide, grassy terrain, he ended up walking alongside her vehicle during the final stretch to the field station. The wind pulled at his hair, and the sunlight caught the metal insignia on his chest. Carried himself with the ease of someone who had been through more difficult marches. "You've never been out here before, have you?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "I don't see the point in traveling unless necessary." "You sound like my father," Elias said with a soft laugh. "He never left our home city until his 60s. Said there was no reason to. Then one day my sister convinced him to take a trip, and after that, he wanted to see everything." The mention of his sister caught Serenia's attention. "You have family back on Earth?" He nodded. "My parents are still there. My sister passed away a few years ago." Serenia slowed her steps. She had not expected the sadness in his tone, nor the openness with which he shared it. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," he said quietly. "She was younger than me, smart, funny, stubborn. She had an illness we couldn't cure at the time. I think that's why I joined the military, not because I wanted to fight, because I wanted to be where I could protect people. I didn't want anyone else's family to feel what ours did." The honesty in his words was disarming. Serenia found herself speaking without her usual caution. "My parents were killed during a border skirmish. A human patrol mistook their transport for a hostile vessel." Elias's expression shifted, his gaze steady. "That must have been difficult." "It was more than difficult," she said. "It's why I chose not to be close to humans." "Why?" She stopped herself. Admitting too much felt dangerous. "Why you're careful," Elias finished for her, his voice calm, not accusing. "I understand." They reached the field station, and the conversation ended there. But the memory of it lingered for the rest of the day. The training operation went smoothly until the final hour, when a sudden commotion broke out on the western side of the plain. A transport carrying supplies had been sabotaged, likely by one of the anti-cooperation factions that opposed the human Valoran alliance. Smoke curled into the air. The soldiers rushed to secure the area. Elias was among the first to respond, moving with precision and focus. Serenia, stationed at the medical tent, received a call for assistance. Several soldiers were injured, including one who had been trapped in the wreckage. She arrived to find Elias pulling debris away from the damaged transport. His hands were scraped, his uniform torn, but he didn't pause. Together they worked to free the trapped soldier, whose leg had been pinned. Serenia administered pain relief and began stabilizing him, aware that Elias was still shielding her from the thick smoke and falling embers. When the soldier was finally evacuated, Elias stayed behind to make sure no one else was trapped. Serenia wanted to tell him to rest, but the look in his eyes focused, determined made her hold her tongue. Only after every person was accounted for did he return to the tent for treatment. "You're injured again?" she said, inspecting. "The cuts on his hands. Part of the job," he replied simply. "Better me than someone else." She treated the wounds in silence, though her thoughts were far from still. His actions were consistent with the man she had come to know, selfless, steady, unwilling to put himself above others. It didn't match the image she had grown up believing in the days that followed. Saranya noticed something else. Whenever other Valerans spoke poorly of humans, something not uncommon in private, she found herself defending Elias. She never said his name. She argued that not all humans were the same, that some were careful, respectful, even gentle. She wasn't sure when she had started thinking of him in those terms. A week later, new orders came down. A critical medical shipment was delayed in a remote sector after reports of hostile activity. Volunteers were needed to escort it back to the base. Elias's name was on the list before she even saw the sign-up. She found him in the corridor as he prepared his gear. "You don't have to take this mission," she said. "It's dangerous." He smiled faintly. "Every mission has risk. This one more than most. I'll be fine," he assured her. Then, after a pause, he added, "If I don't come back, I want you to know I respect your fears. But I think we could overcome them, if you ever wanted to try." Her chest tightened at his words. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, just stating a truth he believed in. She didn't know how to answer, so she said nothing. When the mission left at dawn, she watched the convoy disappear over the horizon. Hours later, a transmission came through. The team was under fire, pinned down in the sector's rocky terrain. No confirmation on casualties yet. Saranya stood frozen in the communications room, listening to the crackle of distant voices. The logical part of her told her she had no reason to feel this way, that he was just another soldier. But the truth ran deeper, and she could not deny it any longer. She was afraid not of starting a family with a human, not of the future, but of losing this one human before she had the chance to know what could have been. The night felt heavier than usual in the base's medical wing. The usual soft hum of the equipment sounded distant to Saranya, like her mind was caught in a slow fog. Every time she looked at the empty cot Elias usually used for his checkups, she felt an uncomfortable pull inside her. She tried to focus on her work restocking supplies, checking medicine expiry dates, but her thoughts kept circling back to the convoy. Reports from the field were slow. Static-filled voices came through the coms every few hours, relaying that the team was still pinned down, that the terrain made extraction difficult. The hostile group in the area was better equipped than expected, using both long-range weapons and traps scattered across the narrow passes. The medics on standby could only wait until reinforcements broke through. But waiting was proving harder than Saranya imagined. By the third day, without clear news, she found herself walking toward the operations center instead of heading to her quarters. The large central table displayed a holographic map of the sector where the convoy was trapped. A cluster of small blinking lights marked the position of the soldiers. Reinforcements were moving closer, but slowly. She recognized the officer in charge, middle-aged Valeron, who had never seemed particularly warm toward humans. He glanced at her as she approached. "You should return to your station," he said. "We'll update you if there's news." "Here to help," Saranya replied firmly. "If there are injured, you'll need someone who knows both human and Valoran treatment protocols." His expression was unreadable, but after a moment, he nodded. "Very well. But you'll stay here until we have a clear retrieval window." It wasn't much, but at least she was closer to any incoming information. Hours passed. The map updated in tiny shifts as the reinforcements drew nearer. Every time she saw the blinking light that represented Elias's team still in position, she felt a quiet relief, but the longer it stayed there, unmoving, the more uneasy she became. Finally, a breakthrough came. The reinforcements breached the first defensive line of the hostile group, forcing them to retreat toward the deeper cliffs. But in the chaos, several soldiers from the convoy team had been injured, one critically. The commander gave the order for a rescue convoy of medics and security to move in. Before anyone could stop her, Saranya stepped forward. "I'm coming with them," the commander hesitated. It's risky. The area isn't fully secure. We'll need medical treatment. On site if you want to keep everyone alive, she said. You know I'm right. A short silence followed. Then he gave a reluctant nod. Very well. Gear up. Within minutes, Serenia was in the back of an armored transport, a landscape rushing past in a blur of pale stone and dry grass. She checked her medkit again and again, making sure every instrument was ready. The soldiers around her were focused, their expressions hard with concentration. She didn't know if Elias was the one who was critically injured, and she didn't dare ask. All she could do was prepare for the worst. When they reached the edge of the rocky pass, the air smelled faintly of smoke. Small fires still burned in scattered patches along the ground. The rescue team split, half moving to secure the perimeter, the other half following Serenia toward the temporary barricade, where the convoy team had been holding their position. The first soldier she saw was slumped against a rock, his leg bandaged roughly. She moved to treat him, but he waved her off. Ward's over there, he said, pointing deeper into the barricade. He's hurt worse. Her chest tightened, but she forced her hands to stay steady as she moved toward the indicated spot. There, leaning against a supply crate, was Elias. His left arm was strapped to his chest, and blood stained the side of his uniform. He was speaking to another soldier, his tone calm despite the exhaustion etched into his face. When he noticed her, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Didn't expect to see you here. You're lucky you do, she said, kneeling. Beside him, let me see the injury. It's not that bad, he began, but she was already scanning him. The device confirmed a deep gash along his ribs, likely from shrapnel. She set to work cleaning and sealing it, ignoring his quiet protests. You should be resting, she said as she worked. So should you, he replied, his voice lighter than his expression. But here we are. The shrapnel had narrowly missed vital organs, but the blood loss was concerning. She worked quickly, applying a biogel seal and wrapping the wound in a compression bandage. When she was finished, she checked his arm, finding only a fracture that had been poorly splinted. She replaced it with a better one, careful not to cause him more pain than necessary. You shouldn't have been moving with these injuries, she told him. I had to make sure everyone else got out of the line of fire, he said simply. You know how it is. Double quotes, yes, she thought. No. And that was the problem. She understood exactly why he had done it. Even though it could have cost him his life, the evacuation began soon after. Serenia stayed close to Elias as they moved toward the transport, ready to steady him if he faltered. He didn't ask for help, but she noticed the subtle way his pace slowed when the terrain grew uneven. Once they were inside the armored vehicle, she sat beside him, monitoring his vitals. You didn't have to come here, he said after a while. I did, she replied. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have been able to stop thinking about it. Looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady. And here I thought you'd decided to keep your distance. She didn't answer right away. The hum of the engine filled the silence between them. Finally, she said quietly, I was wrong about some things. His lips curved into a faint smile, but he didn't press her further. The rest of the ride passed in silence. Back at the base, Elias was taken to the medical wing for further treatment. Serenia oversaw the procedure herself, ensuring the wound was properly closed and the fracture set. When it was over and he was settled in a recovery bed, she stayed longer than necessary, checking his readings and making sure he was comfortable. You're hovering, he said after a while. Am I? She asked, not looking up from the monitor. Double quotes. Yes. Not that I mind. Just unusual. She finally looked at him, meeting his gaze. You made me realize something. I've been letting fear decide my life for a long time. Fear of losing someone. It's fear of making the wrong choice. But you keep proving that some choices are worth the risk. Elias's expression softened. What choice is that? She hesitated, then shook her head. I'm not ready to answer that yet, but I'm closer than I was. He accepted that without pressing, his eyes closing briefly as he relaxed into the bed. Serenia watched him for a moment longer before turning away, her thoughts unsettled but clear in one way: she didn't want this to end here in the days that followed. Word of the rescue spread through the base. Some saw it as a symbol of the Alliance's strength. Others as reckless cooperation. Serenia found herself defending Elias more openly now, unwilling to let others dismiss his actions as mere duty. When she heard someone mutter that humans didn't care about anyone but themselves, she spoke up, her voice steady. "That's not true. I've seen otherwise." It surprised her how natural it felt to say it. Elias recovered steadily, though he was kept off active duty for several weeks. During that time, they spoke often, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing important at all. He told her stories of Earth, of the forests and oceans she had never seen. She told him about the Valoran gardens that stretched for kilometers, glowing softly at night under the biolights. The more they talked, the more she realized how easily they could find common ground despite their differences. Still, the fear lingered at the edges of her mind. She had not forgotten the stories she grew up with, the warnings about mixed families and short human lifespans. But now, those fears were no longer her only truth. There was something else, a quiet, steady pull toward a future she hadn't dared imagine before. One evening, as she walked past the recovery ward, she heard his voice calling her name. She stepped inside to find him sitting up, the faint light from the window casting shadows across his face. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up on me out there. For coming after me when you didn't have to." Felt the words settle deep inside her. "I didn't think about it. I just knew I had to." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them heavy with things unsaid. Then she nodded and left the room, her heart unsteady. But certain of one thing, she could no longer pretend that Elias Ward was just another human soldier. The base felt unusually tense that morning. Serenia could feel it in the hum of the lights and the sharp steps of soldiers moving through the halls. Reports had come in that the hostile faction had regrouped, this time near a supply outpost that provided essential medical equipment to both humans and Valerans. The urgency of the mission was clear. If the supplies didn't reach the base, the wounded would not be treated properly, and lives could be lost. Serenia had just finished restocking her medkits when a message came from the command center. Volunteers were needed for an escort convoy to the outpost. Elias Ward's name was already on the list. Serenia paused, staring at the message as if it had the power to speak to her. Her heart pounded not from fear of danger, though that was part of it, but from something else, something she could not ignore. Without thinking, she signed herself up. She didn't tell anyone why. She simply packed the medkits she knew she would need, double-checked her tools, and prepared herself mentally for whatever awaited. She knew the risks. She also knew she could not stay behind while he faced them. Alone? The convoy set out in the mid-morning sun, the armored vehicles kicking up dust as they moved toward the sector. Serenia rode with the medics, keeping a vigilant eye on the soldiers, especially Elias. He was alert, scanning the terrain, speaking calmly to his team, but she could see the tension in his jaw and the quickness of his glances. He did not complain, did not show fear, but she recognized it. Hours into the journey, the convoy reached a narrow pass flanked by steep cliffs. The hostile faction had set up traps and barricades, forcing the vehicles to slow down. Suddenly, a hail of fire erupted. From the ridge above, the convoy screeched to a halt. Smoke and dust filled the air. Soldiers shouted orders, and the wounded began to cry out. "Medics, stay behind the vehicles," Commander shouted. Serenia ignored the order. She leaped from the armored transport, medkit in hand, scanning the field. She spotted a young Valoran, soldier pinned behind a rock, smoke curling around him. Without hesitation, she ran toward him, dodging small explosions and shards of debris. Her hands were steady as she applied a quick stabilizing treatment. Murmuring calming words to the frightened soldier, Elias was not far behind. He moved with deliberate speed, shielding others from fire as he advanced. When he reached her, he did not speak. He simply nodded, acknowledging her presence. Together, they worked to move the injured soldiers to cover. His movements were precise, confident, protective. Serenia realized that all the tales she had been told about humans being reckless and dangerous were false in his case. This man, this human, risked his life not for glory, but to protect those who could not protect themselves. A sudden explosion rocked the ground near them, throwing Sirenia off balance. She landed hard, twisting her ankle, pain shooting through her leg. She gritted her teeth and began to rise. But before she could, a hand gripped her arm. "Hold still," Elias commanded, steadying her. His eyes met hers, filled with concern, but also something deeper, a quiet certainty that he would not let anything happen to her. Together, they moved forward, navigating the field, tending to the wounded, and keeping the attackers at bay. Every moment was a test of skill, courage, and trust. Sirenia felt her fear melting away, replaced by a focus she had never known before. She relied on him instinctively, and she sensed he relied on her just as instinctively. At one point, they were cornered behind a fallen vehicle. A group of hostile fighters advanced, weapons raised. Elias looked at her. "You can get out of this, but we need to move together. Follow my lead." Her hands tightened around her medkit, her heart hammering. "I'm right with you," she said. They moved as one, ducking low, dodging fire, and using the wreckage for cover. Elias covered her while she stabilized a wounded Valeran. And when it was safe, they sprinted toward the nearest armored transport. Each step tested their endurance, each breath a reminder of the danger they faced. Finally, they reached the vehicle. Sirenia helped load the last injured soldier aboard, then leaned against the side to catch her breath. Elias approached, wiping sweat and dust from his brow, his uniform torn, his hands scratched and bruised. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt an unexpected wave of relief and admiration. "You're impossible," she said, half scolding, half laughing, despite the chaos. "I could say the same about you," he replied, smiling faintly. "I thought medics were supposed to stay safe." She shook her head. "Someone had to make sure you didn't get killed before everyone else." He regarded her quietly for a moment. "I think we'd both die less if we had each other on every mission," he said softly. The words struck her more than the gunfire had. She didn't respond immediately, only watched as he checked the remaining soldiers, ensuring everyone was accounted for. In that moment, she realized how much she had come to care for him, not just respect him, but feel a connection she had never allowed herself to feel with a human before. The convoy returned to the base, battered but intact. The wounded were moved into the medical wing, where Sirenia worked tirelessly, her hands steady even as her heart raced. Elias sat nearby, observing her, assisting where needed. His presence a steady anchor in the chaos. Later, when the ward was quiet, Sirenia found herself walking toward his recovery bed. His injuries had been treated, but he was still sore, still exhausted. She knelt beside him, her hands brushing dust and sweat from his uniform. "You were reckless," she said, shaking her head slightly. "Do you even realize how close you were?" "I do," he said calmly. "But sometimes recklessness is just courage measured in action instead of thought. And I couldn't leave anyone behind." Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him how she felt, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she straightened his blankets and smoothed the sleeve of his uniform. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "for coming with me. For everything." "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I would do it again." The days that followed were filled with recovery and debriefings. The mission had proven the strength of the human Valeran alliance, and the soldiers who had survived were hailed for their bravery. Yet for Sirenia, the real victory was personal. She saw Elias differently now, not as a human soldier who might cause heartbreak, but as a man whose courage, patience, and care had touched her in ways she hadn't thought possible. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sirenia found herself walking along the quiet paths near the base. She wasn't thinking about work or duty. She was thinking about him, about the way he had stood by her, fought alongside her, and yet somehow made her feel safe even in the midst of danger. She reached a small observation deck overlooking the plains. Elias was already there, leaning against the railing, watching the sunset. When he saw her, he straightened and smiled, a gesture simple yet filled with warmth. "You're here," he said. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted. They stood together watching the horizon in silence. The air was filled with the soft hum of distant vehicles, the occasional call of a bird in the plains, and the quiet beat of their own hearts. Arena realized that her fear, the fear that had kept her from ever considering a human as a partner, was still there. But it was no longer all-consuming. It had been replaced, or at least balanced, by something stronger: trust, admiration, and the beginnings of a bond she could not ignore. "You know," he said after a long pause, "we could make it work if we wanted to." Her mind racing, she thought about the risks, the stories she had been told, the lives she had led in careful isolation, and yet she also thought about the moments they had shared the rescue, the quiet conversations, the way he had cared not just for her, but for everyone around him. "I want to believe that," she said quietly. "I really do." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle, respectful. "Then we'll take it one step at a time," he said. "No rush, no pressure, just together." Saranya nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest she had not felt in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included him not just as a human soldier, but as someone she could trust, someone she could care for, someone who might one day share her life. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark, dotted with the first stars of evening, Saranya and Elias stood together, side by side, facing a future that neither of them could fully see, but one they were willing to face together. And for Saranya, that was enough for now. The days at the base passed with a quiet rhythm after the final mission. Soldiers were back to their routines, the wounded recovering steadily. And the alliance between humans and Valorans seemed stronger than ever. Yet for Saranya, life had changed in ways that were subtle but profound. She no longer moved through the halls with only duty in mind. Her thoughts lingered on Elias Ward, on his presence, his quiet strength, and the way he had shown her that not all humans were reckless or careless. Elias, too, seemed different. He was more at ease, less restrained around her, though still careful and respectful. Their moments together had grown longer, filled with quiet conversations, shared walks, and small gestures of concern and care, every shared laugh, every word of comfort. Every moment of trust built a bond neither of them could deny. One morning, the command center issued a new order, a training exchange program with humans and Valorans in a distant sector. The goal was to prepare younger soldiers for joint operations and medical collaboration. Saranya was assigned to oversee the medical component, and Elias would be among the instructors. The news should have been routine, but both of them felt an undercurrent of anticipation. The assignment meant long hours together, and for Saranya, that was an opportunity she could not ignore. As they boarded the transport to the new sector, Elias glanced at her. "Ready for more adventure?" he asked, his tone light but filled with that familiar calm. "I think so," she replied, a small smile forming. "I'm more prepared than I used to be." The journey was smooth, giving them time to talk and observe the landscape below. Saranya found herself asking questions not about work, but about his life on Earth. About the little things he remembered about his sister, about the forests and rivers he had loved. Elias shared willingly, his voice soft and thoughtful. In turn, she spoke about Valoran culture, the gardens, the glow of the biolights at night, and the rare moments of quiet she cherished. They laughed more freely than ever before, their barriers slowly falling away. The training sector was vast, a mix of rocky hills and wide plains. It was the perfect environment for simulation exercises, and the younger soldiers were eager to prove themselves. Saranya's role was crucial. She would be stationed at field hospitals, ready to treat any injuries from the rigorous drills. Elias was to teach defensive strategies, emphasizing teamwork and protection. They moved through the exercises side by side, coordinating seamlessly, each learning more about the other's instincts and strengths. One afternoon, during a particularly challenging simulation, a young Valoran soldier misstepped, triggering a controlled explosion. Saranya reacted instantly, rushing to stabilize him while Elias shielded the area and reassured the other students. When the boy was safe, she looked at Elias, breathless and grateful. "You always know what to do," she said. He shrugged, though the faint smile on his face betrayed pride. "You taught me a lot, too. I trust your judgment more than anyone else's here." Those words settled in her mind. Trust. It had become the foundation of everything between them. She had feared humans, feared loss, feared heartbreak, but with him she found something stronger. A certainty that no matter the danger, no matter the uncertainty of life, they could face it together. Evenings were quiet in the training sector. The younger soldiers retreated to their quarters, and Serena and Elias found themselves alone more often than not. One night as they walked along a hill overlooking the sector, the sky ablaze with stars, Elias stopped, turned to her, his expression serious, yet gentle. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he began. "I don't want to rush you, and I don't want to pressure you. But I need to know if you're willing to take a chance with me. Not just here, not just for this mission, but for the future." Serena's heart skipped a beat. Imagined this moment countless times in her mind, always uncertain of her own courage. She met his gaze, searching for signs of doubt or expectation. Instead, she found patience, understanding, and a quiet hope. "I've been afraid," she admitted softly. "Afraid of losing someone, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of what others might say. But you've shown me that some risks are worth it. That trust and care can overcome fear. I want to try with you." Elias's eyes brightened, and he reached out to take her hand. "Then we'll face it together," he said simply. "Step by step, day by day. No rush. No demands, just us." The next weeks were a testament to their bond. They continued the training program, but every spare moment was spent together. They shared meals, discussed strategies, and explored the quiet parts of the sector. Serena discovered a joy in simple things, walking through the glowing fields. At dusk, sharing stories under the starlit sky, and even laughing at small mishaps during drills. She began to imagine a life beyond the base. A life where humans and Valorans could not only coexist, but thrive together. One day, a small ceremony was held at the base to honor those who had participated in the rescue missions. Elias and Serena were both recognized, though neither sought the attention. When the speeches ended and the awards were presented, Elias turned to her quietly. "This isn't just about the mission," he said. "It's about everything that brought us here. And I want to make sure we don't forget it, that we don't forget what we mean to each other." Serena felt a warmth spread through her chest. She nodded, squeezing his hand gently. "We won't, I promise." After the ceremony, they walked together toward the edge of the sector. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Elias stopped and faced her. "Serena, no, our worlds are different. I know there are challenges we'll face. But I also know that I want to be with you. Not just now, not just here, but always. Will you? Consider starting a life with me." Serena's breath caught. The fear she had carried for so long, the fear of loss, of heartbreak, of impossibility was still there, but it was now overshadowed by hope, trust, and love. She looked into his eyes, saw the sincerity and patience there, and knew her answer. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and filled with certainty. "I will." The relief and joy in his expression was unmistakable. He pulled her into a gentle embrace, and for the first time, Serena allowed herself to feel completely safe. The base, the missions, the uncertainties of life, all of it faded. For a moment, leaving only the certainty of their connection. In the following months, they began planning for a future together. They spoke openly about the challenges, the differences in lifespan, the physical differences between humans and Valorans, and the judgments of others who might not understand. But each conversation only strengthened their resolve. They learned from each other, finding ways to adapt and compromise. Building a foundation that was strong and flexible, Serena even began to consider the possibility of starting a family. The fear that had once paralyzed her was still present, but it no longer ruled her. She could imagine a life where humans and Valorans shared not only friendship and alliance but love, family, and legacy. She could imagine children who carried the best of both worlds, raised in an environment of trust, care, and cooperation. Elias, for his part, was patient and encouraging. He never pressured her, never dismissed her fears. Instead, he supported her in every step, always ready to share the burden of uncertainty. Together, they discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. By the time the training exchange program concluded, Serenia and Elias had become inseparable. Their colleagues and fellow soldiers noticed the bond between them, a quiet but powerful connection built on shared experiences, trust, and respect. Though some were surprised, most admired the partnership that had emerged, proof that cooperation between humans and Valorans could extend beyond strategy and missions. Reaching into the realm of the heart, one quiet evening, Serenia and Elias stood on the observation deck of the base, looking out over the plains that had become familiar over the months. The sky was clear, stars twinkling like distant fires. They stood close, hands intertwined, hearts aligned. "Do you think we're ready?" Serenia asked, her voice soft but confident. Elias smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We'll never be perfect. There will always be challenges, always risks. But we're ready for each other, and that's what matters." Serenia nodded, feeling a sense of peace she had never known. The fear that had once held her captive was gone, replaced by trust, hope, and love. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew they would face it together, side by side. "I never thought I'd feel this way about a human," she admitted with a faint laugh. "I never thought I'd find someone like you in a galaxy full of stars," Elias replied, his voice warm and steady. They stood together, gazing at the horizon, and for the first time, Serenia allowed herself to imagine the life they could build, a life full of possibility, courage, and love. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if reflecting the bond that had grown between them. And for the first time she knew with a certainty that she was ready to take the next step. Their hands tightened around each other, a silent promise of partnership, trust, and a shared future. The fears of the past were gone, replaced by the certainty that they could face anything together. Serenia finally understood that love and courage were not defined by the species one was born into, but by the choices one made and the here